Get out of my sight, and don't call me again unless it's critical. Khalid Al-Farouk slammed the phone onto the marble counter, his jaw clenched with barely contained anger. His business meeting had been another grueling battle of egos, where every participant sought to outmaneuver him. Khalid always emerged victorious, but the weight of these victories felt heavier each time. As he paced the pristine hall of his sprawling Manhattan mansion, the emptiness of his surroundings echoed louder than the sound of his polished shoes against the cold floors. Suddenly, a knock shattered the tense silence. Khalid frowned. No one knocked on his door unannounced. Security was tight, and every visitor was vetted. He approached cautiously, his irritation mounting. When he swung open the heavy oak door, he was greeted by the sight of a young woman, drenched from the pouring rain. Her clothes hung limply on her thin frame, and her hair stuck to her face. She wasn't just soaked, she looked utterly defeated. "I'm sorry," she stammered, her voice barely audible over the rain. "I didn't mean to bother you, but I just need a place to rest for a moment." Khalid's first instinct was to shut the door. He had no time for strangers and no patience for street beggars. But something about her eyes stopped him. They weren't pleading. They were hollow, a deep void that mirrored an ache he tried for years to ignore. "Who are you?" he demanded, his tone harsher than he intended. "My name is Sophie," she replied, shivering. "I don't want money. Her voice cracked. "It's freezing out here." Khalid hesitated. He wasn't the type to let emotions dictate his actions, but for reasons he couldn't explain, he stepped aside. "Come in." Sophie entered cautiously, her eyes darting around the massive entryway. The stark contrast between her ragged appearance and the opulent interior was impossible to ignore. The grand chandelier, the marble floors, the priceless artwork on the walls. It was a world she didn't belong to. "Stay here," Khalid ordered, gesturing toward a bench near the door. He walked briskly to another room and returned moments later with a towel and a robe. "Dry off. You're dripping water everywhere." She accepted the towel with trembling hands and muttered a quiet, "Thank you." Khalid watched her for a moment, unsure of what to do next. He'd taken her in out of impulse, but now he questioned his judgment. He didn't even know this girl. For all he knew, she could be a thief, or worse. Yet, as she struggled to steady her shaking hands while wrapping the towel around herself, he couldn't summon the will to send her back into the storm. "Why are you out there?" he finally asked, his voice softening slightly. Sophie hesitated, her eyes fixed on the towel as she twisted it nervously. "I don't have anywhere else to go." "That much is obvious," he said, his tone unintentionally cutting. When she flinched, he sighed. "What happened to you?" "It's a long story," she replied, clearly avoiding the question. "I have time." Her lips pressed into a thin line, as if weighing whether she could trust him. After a long pause, she said, "I lost my family. Everything spiraled after that. I've been on my own for a while." Khalid crossed his arms, leaning against the wall. "That's vague. Do you want me to stay or leave?" She shot back, a flash of defiance breaking through her timid demeanor. He smirked, slightly impressed by her spirit. "You can stay. For now." Sophie visibly relaxed but said nothing. Khalid wasn't used to sharing his space with anyone, let alone a stranger. Yet, as the awkward silence stretched between them, he found himself oddly intrigued. "What do you expect me to do for you?" he asked bluntly. "Nothing," she said quickly. "I'm not here to take advantage of you. I just needed shelter for a moment. I'll leave as soon as the rain stops." He studied her, trying to decipher the layers beneath her guarded expression. "You'll stay the night," he declared. "We'll figure out the rest in the morning." Her eyes widened. "I don't want to impose." "You already are," he replied. "But it's fine. My house is big enough to accommodate one more person." Before she could protest further, Khalid waved her off and disappeared into another room. Sophie sat on the bench, clutching the towel tightly, her mind racing. She didn't trust Khalid's sudden generosity, but she also couldn't deny how grateful she was to be out of the storm. As Khalid walked down the hallway, his mind churned with conflicting thoughts. He couldn't explain why he'd let her in, why he cared enough to offer her a place to stay. All he knew was that this girl, with her hollow eyes and fragile frame, had stirred something inside him, something he hadn't felt in years. What was it about her that felt so familiar? And why did it feel like this was only the beginning of something much larger than either of them could imagine? The rain had stopped by morning, but Sophie lingered in the grand mansion's guest room, feeling like an intruder in a world she didn't belong to. She ran her fingers over the plush bedding, marveling at the sheer luxury surrounding her. The polished furniture gleamed, and even the faint scent of lavender in the air seemed impossibly refined. Sophie had never experienced anything like it, and part of her feared it was all a fleeting dream. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sharp knock on the door. Before she could answer, Khalid stepped in, his presence as commanding as ever. He wore a perfectly tailored suit, and his expression carried its usual mix of impatience and detachment. "Did you sleep well?" he asked curtly, not waiting for an answer. "I had my staff prepare breakfast downstairs. Eat something before you leave." Sophie's stomach twisted. She wanted to protest, to assure him she didn't need charity, but her pride clashed with her hunger. "Thank you," she said quietly, avoiding his gaze. As she followed him to the dining room, Sophie tried to make herself invisible. The house was more alive now, with staff moving efficiently through its massive halls, their steps brisk and purposeful. Khalid barely acknowledged them, his focus fixed ahead. Sophie couldn't help but notice how everyone seemed to keep their distance from him, their interactions perfunctory and void of warmth. In the dining room, a lavish spread awaited: fresh fruit, pastries, eggs, and more. Sophie hesitated at the sheer abundance. Khalid gestured for her to sit, his expression unreadable. "Help yourself," he said, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "I assume it's been a while since you've had a proper meal." Sophie bristled at his bluntness, but kept her emotions in check. She carefully took a piece of toast, though her appetite felt drowned by the weight of the situation. Khalid watched her in silence for a moment before speaking. "What's your plan now?" She froze mid-bite, her mind scrambling for an answer. I don't know yet. I'll figure something out." "That's not much of a plan," he said, his tone sharp. Sophie set the toast down, her eyes narrowing. "I didn't ask for your help, remember? I just needed a place to get out of the rain. You don't owe me anything, and I don't owe you." Khalid leaned back in his chair, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You've got spirit. I'll give you that." Her face flushed, unsure if he was mocking her or genuinely impressed. Before she could respond, Khalid leaned forward, his expression turning serious. "I don't usually involve myself in other people's problems," he said, "but you've already made it inside my house, and I don't believe in half measures. If you want to change your circumstances, I can help you, but only if you're willing to help yourself." Sophie stared at him, unsure of how to respond. "What are you saying?" "I'm offering you an opportunity," he said plainly. "Stay here for a while. Get back on your feet. But there will be rules. You'll contribute to this household. No handouts." The proposition left her stunned. Part of her wanted to refuse, to walk out the door and leave this intimidating man and his imposing mansion behind. But another part of her, the part that had spent countless nights shivering on the streets, scavenging for scraps, knew she couldn't afford to reject his offer. "What kind of rules?" she asked cautiously. "You'll start by helping around the house," he said. "Simple tasks. My staff will instruct you. In return, you'll have a place to stay and food to eat. It's not charity. It's an arrangement." Sophie hesitated, her pride warring with practicality. The idea of working in a mansion like this, surrounded by people who clearly didn't want her there, was daunting. But the alternative, returning to the streets, was far worse. "Fine," she said finally. "I'll do it." Khalid nodded, satisfied. "Good. You'll begin tomorrow." With that, he rose from the table, his coffee cup in hand. "Don't make me regret this," he added before walking away, leaving Sophie alone with her thoughts and a heavy sense of uncertainty. As the echoes of his footsteps faded, Sophie sat back in her chair, feeling the weight of her decision settle over her. She had no idea what she just signed up for, but one thing was clear. Her life was about to change in ways she couldn't yet imagine. Sophie stood in the grand kitchen the next morning, feeling completely out of place. The head housekeeper, a stern woman named Evelyn, eyed her with thinly veiled skepticism. Around them, the staff moved briskly, their movements efficient and precise, each person knowing exactly what to do and when. "You'll start with cleaning," Evelyn said, handing Sophie a set of neatly folded cleaning cloths and a spray bottle. "Stick to the guest rooms and hallways for now. Don't touch anything in Mr. Al-Farouk's private quarters." Sophie nodded, gripping the supplies tightly. "Got it." Evelyn's expression softened just slightly, though her tone remained brisk. "Do your job well, and you'll earn their respect," she said, gesturing to the other staff members. "But make no mistake, everyone here works hard. Mr. Al-Farouk doesn't tolerate laziness or mistakes." Sophie swallowed hard. The weight of Evelyn's words settled heavily on her shoulders as she made her way upstairs, her cleaning supplies in hand. The mansion, so vast and elegant, felt more intimidating than ever. She was acutely aware of how out of place she looked, her worn sneakers squeaking faintly against the polished floors. Her first task was to clean a set of guest rooms that hadn't been used in weeks. The rooms were immaculate, their perfection making her feel even smaller. As she wiped down the already gleaming surfaces, Sophie's thoughts drifted to Khalid's stern expression and the intensity in his eyes when he'd made his offer. He wasn't a man who gave second chances, and she knew she couldn't afford to mess this up. By midday, her arms ached, and her feet felt heavy. Sophie paused briefly in the hallway, leaning against a doorframe to catch her breath. She couldn't remember the last time she'd worked so hard, but there was a strange sense of satisfaction in knowing she was earning her keep. As she stood there, lost in thought, a voice startled her. "You missed a spot." She turned quickly to see Khalid standing a few feet away, his arms crossed and a faint smirk playing on his lips. He was dressed casually for once, his usual suit replaced by a tailored shirt and dark jeans. Despite his relaxed attire, his presence was just as commanding. Sophie's face flushed. Sorry," she stammered, fumbling with the cleaning cloth. Khalid's smirk widened slightly. "Relax. I'm not here to critique your technique." "Then why are you here?" she asked, a bit more sharply than she intended. His expression shifted, becoming unreadable. "I was curious. How are you finding your first day?" "It's fine," she said quickly, focusing on the cloth in her hand. "Hard work isn't new to me." He nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "Good. Keep it that way." Before she could respond, he turned and walked away, leaving Sophie with a mix of irritation and confusion. She couldn't figure him out. One moment, he seemed cold and aloof. The next, there was a flicker of something almost human. As the day wore on, Sophie's initial nervousness gave way to determination. By the time she finished her tasks, she was exhausted but proud of what she'd accomplished. The guest rooms and hallways sparkled, and she hoped it would be enough to satisfy Evelyn and Khalid. That evening, as she sat in the small room Evelyn had assigned her, Sophie allowed herself a moment of reflection. Her body ached, but there was a strange sense of stability in knowing she had a roof over her head and a purpose for the first time in years. She still didn't fully trust Khalid or his motives, but for now, she was willing to play by his rules. What choice did she have? As she drifted off to sleep, Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that her presence in Khalid's world was more than a simple act of charity. Something about him, his guarded demeanor, his piercing eyes, hinted at a deeper story, one she wasn't sure she wanted to uncover. Sophie awoke to a knock on her door, the sound pulling her from a restless sleep. She glanced at the clock on the nightstand, 5:30 a.m. Her body ached from the previous day's work, but the urgency of the knock left no room for hesitation. She quickly pulled on a sweater and opened the door to find Evelyn standing there, her expression unreadable. "Follow me," Evelyn said briskly, without offering an explanation. Sophie didn't ask questions. She hurried after Evelyn, her mind racing with possibilities. Had she done something wrong? Was Khalid already regretting his offer? Evelyn led her to the kitchen, where a small group of staff was gathered, speaking in hushed tones. The room, usually filled with an air of efficiency, now carried a palpable tension. Evelyn turned to Sophie, her voice low but firm. "One of the caterers scheduled for Mr. Al-Farouk's meeting today called in sick. You'll step in." Sophie blinked. "Me?" But I don't know. You'll learn, Evelyn interrupted. The instructions are simple. Set up the refreshments in the conference room and ensure everything runs smoothly. This meeting is important, so there's no room for mistakes. Understood? Sophie swallowed her protests and nodded. Understood. As Evelyn handed her a tray of neatly arranged finger foods and coffee, Sophie felt her nerves spike. This wasn't cleaning guest rooms or polishing furniture. This was stepping into Khalid's professional domain, a space where the stakes felt immeasurably higher. When she arrived at the conference room, Sophie carefully arranged the refreshments on the long mahogany table, her hands trembling slightly. The room was pristine, its walls lined with bookshelves and modern art. She barely had time to finish setting up before the first attendees began to arrive. Men and women in tailored suits, their conversations sharp and deliberate. Khalid entered last, his presence immediately commanding the room's attention. He barely glanced at Sophie as he took his seat at the head of the table, his expression focused and severe. She was relieved by his lack of acknowledgement. The last thing she needed was him scrutinizing her every move. As the meeting progressed, Sophie hovered near the back of the room, quietly refilling coffee cups and replacing empty plates. She did her best to remain invisible, but her heart raced every time Khalid's voice filled the room. He spoke with authority and precision, his words cutting through the discussions with the ease of someone accustomed to control. At one point, a man seated near the middle of the table waved her over, his tone impatient. "Miss, more coffee." Sophie quickly moved to his side, the pot in hand. As she poured, the man turned to Khalid. "Your new staff?" he asked, his voice laced with condescension. Khalid glanced at Sophie for the first time since the meeting began, his expression unreadable. "She's temporary," he said curtly, before redirecting the conversation back to business. The dismissal stung, but Sophie kept her face neutral, focusing on her task. She reminded herself that this wasn't about earning Khalid's approval. It was about proving to herself that she could handle whatever was thrown her way. As the meeting concluded, the attendees filed out, their discussions continuing as they moved toward the exit. Sophie began clearing the table, her shoulders relaxing slightly now that the ordeal was over. "You did well." She looked up sharply to find Khalid standing a few feet away, his arms crossed and his expression softer than usual. It wasn't exactly praise, but coming from him, it felt significant. "Thank you," Sophie said cautiously, unsure of his intentions. He studied her for a moment, as though weighing his next words. Not many people can handle pressure like that. "Keep it up." Before she could respond, he turned and walked away, leaving her alone in the quiet room. For the first time since entering the mansion, Sophie felt a flicker of confidence. She wasn't just surviving. She was holding her own in a world that had once felt impossible to navigate. As she finished cleaning up and returned to her modest quarters, Sophie allowed herself a small smile. Khalid's approval might have been fleeting, but it was enough to remind her that she wasn't powerless. She could adapt. She could endure. And maybe, just maybe, she could prove that she belonged here after all. Sophie's days fell into a rhythm, each one blending into the next as she navigated her new reality within Khalid's mansion. The work was exhausting but manageable, and though the staff remained distant, she was beginning to feel like she belonged, at least in the smallest sense. Khalid, however, remained an enigma, a towering figure who seemed to watch her progress from the shadows without fully engaging. Late one evening, as Sophie was finishing her duties in the library, she noticed a faint light glowing through the crack of the door to Khalid's office. She paused, hesitant. The house was unusually quiet, the rest of the staff having retired for the night. Curiosity gnawed at her. Khalid's private spaces had always seemed impenetrable, a realm where she didn't dare venture, yet here was an opening. Before she could convince herself to walk away, the sound of something breaking shattered the silence. It was sharp, a glass or ceramic object hitting the floor. Sophie's hesitation evaporated as she moved quickly toward the sound. She knocked gently on the door, her hand trembling. "Mr. Al-Farouk, is everything all right?" There was a pause, long enough for Sophie to consider retreating. Then Khalid's voice came, low and rough. "Come in." She pushed the door open and stepped inside. Khalid stood near his desk, his tie loosened and his sleeves rolled up. A shattered glass lay on the floor at his feet, its contents, amber liquid, spilling onto the expensive rug. His normally composed expression was strained, his jaw tight. I can clean that up, Sophie said, pointing at the mess. Don't bother, Khalid replied, waving her off. I'll deal with it. Despite his dismissal, Sophie moved toward the broken glass. She grabbed a cloth from a nearby shelf and crouched to blot the spill. Khalid didn't stop her, but his eyes remained fixed on her as she worked. You're persistent, he said after a moment, his voice softer than usual. Sophie glanced up at him. I just don't like leaving things unfinished. He smirked faintly, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. Neither do I. The room fell into silence as she cleaned, but the tension lingered, thick and heavy. When she stood to discard the broken glass, Khalid gestured for her to sit. It wasn't a request, it was a command. Why are you really here? He asked, his gaze piercing. Sophie frowned. You offered me a place to stay. You know why I'm here. That's not what I mean, Khalid said, his tone sharper. What's your endgame? What are you hoping to achieve by staying here? She met his eyes, her frustration bubbling to the surface. Do you always assume people have an agenda? Not everyone wants something from you. Everyone wants something, Khalid countered, his voice low and certain, whether they admit it or not. Sophie's jaw tightened, but she refused to look away. I want a chance. That's it. A chance to prove that I'm more than the mess my life turned into. You don't have to believe me, but it's the truth. Khalid leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. And what happens when that chance isn't enough? When life throws you back into the gutter, what will you do then? I'll survive, Sophie said simply. I've done it before. Her words seemed to catch him off guard. For a moment, his stoic mask slipped, and something raw flickered in his eyes. It was gone as quickly as it came, but Sophie saw it. The vulnerability he worked so hard to hide. You're stronger than you look, Khalid admitted, his tone softening. But strength isn't always enough. Maybe not, she said. But it's all I have. They stared at each other in silence, the weight of their unspoken thoughts filling the room. Finally, Khalid broke the gaze and reached for the decanter on his desk, pouring himself another drink. He didn't offer her one, and she didn't expect him to. You should go, he said, his voice regaining its usual edge. It's late. Sophie hesitated but nodded. As she turned to leave, Khalid's voice stopped her at the door. For what it's worth, he said, I don't think you're just a mess. She glanced back at him, surprised. He wasn't looking at her, his focus on the drink in his hand, but his words lingered in the air. Sophie left the office without another word, her mind racing. Khalid's walls were still firmly in place, but tonight, she'd seen the first cracks, and for reasons she couldn't explain, she felt a strange sense of hope. The following morning, Sophie arrived in the dining room to find Khalid already seated at the head of the table. His usual air of composure had returned, and he barely looked up as she entered. A plate of untouched fruit sat before him, and he was absorbed in reading something on his tablet. Good morning, Sophie said cautiously, unsure if the tension from the previous night had lingered. Khalid glanced up briefly, his expression neutral. Morning. She hesitated for a moment, then took a seat at the far end of the table. Breakfast had already been laid out, freshly baked bread, eggs, and an assortment of spreads. Sophie served herself a modest portion, acutely aware of the silence stretching between them. Halfway through the meal, Khalid spoke without looking up. You handled yourself well yesterday during the meeting. The compliment, or what passed for one from Khalid, caught her off guard. Thank you, she said, unsure how to respond. I'm serious, he continued. You didn't falter under pressure. That's rare. Sophie frowned, setting down her fork. Why do you sound so surprised? Did you think I'd fail? I didn't think anything, Khalid replied smoothly. I simply observe. Right? Sophie said, her tone edged with sarcasm. Because that's what you do. Sit back and observe while everyone else does the work. Khalid raised an eyebrow, but instead of reacting with his usual sharpness, he smirked faintly. Careful. That kind of defiance might get you in trouble. Sophie met his gaze, her confidence bolstered by the small victories she'd accumulated in the past few days. Or it might get me noticed. Khalid set his tablet aside, his full attention now on her. You're already noticed. The question is, what will you do with that? The weight of his words hung in the air, but Sophie wasn't sure how to answer. She wasn't even sure what he was expecting her to say. Instead, she turned the question back on him. And what do you want from me? You say you're giving me a chance, but why? What's in it for you? Khalid leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. Perhaps I see potential in you. Or maybe I'm just curious. Curious about what? Whether you'll prove me wrong, he said simply. Sophie bristled at the implication but held her tongue. She wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing her rattled. Instead, she finished her breakfast in silence, determined to prove herself in actions rather than words. Later that day, Evelyn assigned Sophie to assist in the library, organizing a collection of rare books Khalid had recently acquired. The task was tedious but oddly soothing, and Sophie found herself engrossed in the work. As she carefully arranged the books on the shelves, she noticed a small, leather-bound journal tucked behind a row of novels. It was old and worn, its edges frayed from years of use. Curiosity got the better of her. Sophie opened the journal, flipping through its pages. It wasn't a personal diary. It appeared to be a collection of handwritten notes and sketches, some in English, others in Arabic. The handwriting was precise and elegant, and the pages were filled with detailed observations about business, philosophy, and life. Fascinating, isn't it? Sophie jumped, nearly dropping the journal. She turned to see Khalid standing in the doorway, his arms crossed. His expression was hard to read, but there was no mistaking the slight edge in his voice. I wasn't snooping, Sophie said quickly, holding the journal up. It was just here. I know, Khalid said, stepping into the room. He took the journal from her hands and glanced at it briefly before placing it back on the shelf. That belonged to my father. Sophie blinked, surprised. Your father? Khalid nodded, his gaze distant. He kept meticulous records of everything. Business ideas, personal reflections, even random thoughts that came to him in the middle of the night. I inherited his habit, though I'm not as disciplined about it. There was a vulnerability in his voice that Sophie hadn't heard before. She hesitated, unsure if she should press further, but her curiosity won out. Was he like you? She asked cautiously. Khalid smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. In some ways, he was brilliant, driven, and relentless. But he had something I've never quite mastered. What's that? Balance, Khalid said simply. He knew how to be both a leader and a father. I've only ever managed one. The admission caught Sophie off guard. Khalid always seemed so composed, so in control, yet here he was, revealing a crack in his armor. She wanted to ask more, to understand the man behind the stoic exterior, but Khalid straightened, his expression hardening once more. You've done well today, he said, his tone shifting back to its usual detachment. Finish up here and report to Evelyn for your next task. Sophie nodded, watching as he left the room. She couldn't shake the feeling that she'd glimpsed a part of Khalid that few ever saw, a part of him that, despite his wealth and power, was just as human and vulnerable as anyone else. As she returned to her work, Sophie felt a strange mix of emotions. She still didn't fully trust Khalid, but for the first time, she saw him not as an untouchable figure, but as someone who carried his own burdens. And in that realization, she found a renewed sense of determination. If Khalid believed she had potential, she wasn't going to waste the opportunity to prove him right. Or perhaps, to prove herself wrong. Sophie was polishing the windows in the main hallway when the sound of the front doors opening drew her attention. She glanced over her shoulder to see a woman walking in, her stride confident and her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. The woman was striking, with an air of authority that rivaled Khalid's. Her tailored blazer and designer bag made it clear she belonged in this world, a stark contrast to Sophie's plain work clothes. Is Khalid in? The woman asked one of the staff members near the entrance. Her tone was crisp, as though she was accustomed to getting what she wanted. Yes, Ms. Harper, the staff member replied. He's in his study. Shall I? No need, the woman interrupted, already heading toward the study. Sophie stood frozen, unsure whether to continue her work or retreat to avoid attention. She learned quickly that Khaled's visitors often carried the same aura of detachment and authority he did. But something about this woman felt different, more personal. Before Sophie could decide what to do, Evelyn appeared at her side. "Keep working," she instructed quietly, her tone leaving no room for argument. "And don't get involved." Sophie nodded and turned back to the window, though her curiosity burned. Who was this woman, and why did she feel so important? The muffled sound of voices soon drifted down the hall, growing louder as the conversation between Khaled and Miss Harper became more heated. Sophie tried not to listen, but it was impossible to ignore. "You can't keep shutting people out, Khaled," the woman said, her voice firm but not unkind. "It's not sustainable." "I'm not shutting anyone out," Khaled replied, his tone clipped. "I'm protecting what I've built." "Is that what you call it? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're isolating yourself." There was a pause, and Sophie risked a glance toward the study. The door was ajar, and she could see Khaled standing with his back to her, his posture rigid. "This isn't your concern, Harper," he said finally. "I appreciate your advice, but I can handle my own life." The woman sighed. "That's exactly the problem, Khaled. You think you have to handle everything on your own." Sophie quickly turned away as footsteps approached, pretending to focus intently on the window. Miss Harper emerged from the study moments later, her expression unreadable. She passed by without so much as a glance at Sophie, her heels echoing through the hallway until the front doors closed behind her. The house felt oddly still in the aftermath of her departure. Sophie glanced toward the study again, debating whether to check on Khaled. The tension in his voice during the conversation lingered in her mind, and though she knew Evelyn would scold her for overstepping, she found herself moving toward the study before she could think better of it. The door was still ajar, and Sophie hesitated before knocking softly. "Mr. Al-Farouk?" "Come in," Khaled said, his voice quieter now. She stepped inside, finding him seated at his desk. His usual composure seemed strained, his gaze fixed on the papers in front of him. Sophie hesitated, unsure of what to say. "Is everything okay?" she asked cautiously. Khaled glanced up, his expression unreadable. For a moment, she thought he might dismiss her, but instead, he leaned back in his chair with a sigh. "Harper has a talent for stating the obvious," he said dryly. "Is she a business associate?" Sophie asked, her curiosity getting the better of her. "She's my lawyer," Khaled replied, "and an old friend. She thinks she knows what's best for me." Sophie hesitated, unsure if she should press further. "Sometimes it's easier to see things from the outside." Khaled's lips twitched, almost forming a smile. "You're full of insights today." "I'm just saying," Sophie continued, emboldened by his reaction. "Maybe she's not wrong." He studied her for a moment, his gaze sharp yet thoughtful. "You're not afraid to speak your mind, are you?" Sophie shrugged. "Not when I think it's worth saying." Khaled leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "And what do you think you've seen from the outside?" The question caught her off guard, but she didn't back down. "I think you keep people at arm's length because you're afraid of what happens if they get too close." Khaled's expression darkened slightly, but he didn't interrupt. "And I think," Sophie added, her voice steady, "you've convinced yourself that it's safer that way. But it's also lonelier." For a long moment, Khaled said nothing. The silence was heavy, and Sophie wondered if she'd overstepped. But then, to her surprise, he nodded. "You're not wrong," he said quietly. "But knowing that doesn't make it any easier." Sophie didn't know how to respond. Khaled's honesty, however brief, left her unsettled. She wanted to help, to offer some kind of comfort, but she knew better than to push too far. "I should get back to work," she said finally. Khaled nodded, his gaze returning to the papers on his desk. As Sophie left the study, she couldn't shake the feeling that she crossed an invisible line, one that brought her closer to understanding the man who had taken her in, but also revealed how far he still kept himself from everyone else. Sophie was in the garden, pulling weeds from the flower beds as instructed by Evelyn, when she noticed Khaled standing on the balcony above. He was on the phone, gesturing sharply as he paced. Though she couldn't hear his words, his body language was unmistakable. Frustration, perhaps even anger, radiated from him in waves. He ended the call abruptly, his shoulders tense as he leaned against the railing. It was a rare sight, one that reminded Sophie of the cracks she'd glimpsed in Khaled's otherwise impenetrable armor. She wondered what it must be like to shoulder the weight of his world, where every decision seemed to carry monumental stakes. She was still lost in thought when Evelyn's voice pulled her back to reality. "Don't stare," Evelyn said briskly as she walked past with a watering can. "It's not your place to be curious." Sophie quickly looked away, focusing back on the soil. "I wasn't staring," she muttered, though she knew it wasn't entirely true. Evelyn sighed, her tone softening slightly. "It's better to keep your head down, Sophie. Mr. Al-Farouk's life is complicated. Don't get caught in it." Sophie nodded, but couldn't shake the nagging feeling that Evelyn's warning came from a place of experience rather than simple professionalism. Later that evening, Sophie was tidying up the library when Khaled walked in unexpectedly. He seemed different, less composed than usual. His tie was loosened, and his expression carried a hint of exhaustion. Sophie straightened instinctively, unsure if she should acknowledge his presence or quietly slip away. "You don't have to stop," Khaled said, his voice cutting through the silence. He gestured toward the shelves. "I'm just here to think." Sophie hesitated before nodding. She returned to her work, though she couldn't help but steal glances at him. Khaled sat down in one of the armchairs, his gaze distant. The tension in his posture was unmistakable. "You seem off today," Sophie said cautiously, breaking the silence. She wasn't sure why she spoke. Perhaps it was the familiarity they'd begun to develop, or perhaps it was simple curiosity. Khaled's lips curved into a faint, humorless smile. "You're observant." "It's hard not to be," Sophie replied. "You're not exactly subtle." He chuckled softly, though the sound lacked warmth. "A long day, that's all." Sophie set down the duster she'd been holding, her curiosity getting the better of her. "Is it about the phone call earlier? You looked stressed." Khaled's gaze flicked to her, sharp and assessing. For a moment, she thought he might tell her to mind her own business. But instead, he leaned back in the chair and sighed. "It's nothing new," he said, his tone quieter now. "Just another crisis to solve, another fire to put out. It never ends." "Sounds exhausting," Sophie said, her voice soft. "It is." Khaled's expression grew distant again. "But that's the cost of success, isn't it? You work, you sacrifice, and eventually, you forget why you started in the first place." Sophie hesitated, unsure if she should respond. But something about his words struck a chord. "Maybe it doesn't have to be that way," she said. "Maybe you can find a way to make it mean something again." Khaled looked at her, his eyes narrowing slightly. "And how would you suggest I do that?" "I don't know," Sophie admitted, "but it seems like you're trying to do everything alone. Maybe that's the problem." His gaze lingered on her for a moment, and she wondered if she'd gone too far. But then he nodded, almost imperceptibly. "You're not wrong," Khaled said, his voice softer. "But letting people in, it's not as simple as it sounds." "I get that," Sophie said. "But if you don't try, you'll never know." Khaled didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stood and walked toward the shelves, running his fingers along the spines of the books. "You're a curious one, Sophie," he said finally. "Most people in your position wouldn't dare to speak so freely." "I guess I'm not most people," she replied with a small smile. Khaled turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "No, you're not." The room fell into a comfortable silence as Khaled returned to his chair and Sophie resumed her work. Though their conversation had been brief, it left Sophie with the distinct feeling that something had shifted between them. Khaled, for all his walls and defenses, had allowed her a glimpse of the man behind the mask. And though she didn't fully understand him yet, she felt a growing sense of connection, a fragile thread that, for the first time, seemed to run both ways. Sophie was in the kitchen early the next morning, helping Evelyn prepare for another of Khaled's high-stakes meetings. Though her tasks were menial, arranging pastries, filling pitchers with water, she'd come to appreciate the structure of her days. It was a far cry from the chaos of her old life. As she worked, Evelyn handed her a tray of coffee cups and gestured toward the hallway. "Take these to the study. Mr. Al-Farouk will need them before his guests arrive." Sophie nodded and carried the tray carefully, balancing it as she made her way through the mansion. She knocked lightly on the study door, and Khaled's voice called out, "Come in." She pushed the door open and stepped inside. Khaled was at his desk, reviewing a stack of papers. His usual intensity was on full display, but he looked up briefly as Sophie entered. "Set it there," he said, gesturing to a side table without breaking his focus. Sophie placed the tray down, but as she turned to leave, her eyes caught on something unusual, a framed photograph lying face down on the desk. It was out of place among the neatly arranged papers and expensive pins. Khaled noticed her hesitation. "Something on your mind?" he asked, his tone sharper than usual. "No," Sophie said quickly, though her curiosity was undeniable. She gestured to the photo. "I just didn't expect you to keep personal pictures here." For a moment, Khaled didn't respond. Then, with a sigh, he picked up the frame and set it upright. The photograph was of a family, a man and a woman, both smiling warmly with a young boy standing between them. The boy's eyes were unmistakably Khaled's. "My parents," he said simply, his voice devoid of emotion. Sophie studied the photo for a moment before speaking. "You look happy." Khaled's lips pressed into a thin line. "Appearances can be deceiving." Sophie hesitated, unsure if she should push further. But Khaled surprised her by continuing. "My father was a businessman, like me, ambitious, driven, and relentless. He taught me everything I know about building an empire. But he also taught me the cost of it." "What do you mean?" Sophie asked softly. Khaled leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant. He sacrificed everything for success. Time with his family, his health, even his integrity. By the time I was old enough to understand, it was too late. My mother, she couldn't handle it. She left when I was 12. Sophie's chest tightened at the admission. "I'm sorry," she said, though the words felt inadequate. Khaled shrugged, his expression hardening. "It is what it is. My father raised me on his own after that, but he never stopped chasing the next deal, the next achievement. I suppose I inherited more from him than I'd like to admit." Sophie watched him carefully, sensing the weight of his words. "You're not your father," she said gently. "You can choose a different path." Khaled met her gaze, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "Perhaps," he said quietly. "But it's not that simple." Sophie nodded, understanding that the conversation had reached its limit. She turned to leave, but Khaled's voice stopped her. "Thank you," he said, surprising her. "For listening." She offered him a small smile. "Anytime." As she left the study, Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just uncovered another piece of the puzzle that was Khaled Al-Farouk. Beneath his cold exterior was a man shaped by loss, ambition, and the fear of repeating the mistakes of the past. And though she didn't know if she could truly help him, she felt a growing resolve to try. The days following Sophie's conversation with Khaled carried a subtle shift. While his demeanor remained guarded, there was a slight easing of the tension that often accompanied their interactions. Sophie noticed it in small ways. How he no longer avoided her presence entirely, or how his sharp comments had softened to something closer to teasing. Yet, she also sensed an undercurrent of resistance, as if Khaled was aware of the walls she was slowly chipping away at and was determined to keep them intact. One afternoon, Sophie was organizing the pantry when Evelyn appeared with an unusual request. "Sophie, Mr. Al-Farouk needs assistance with a last-minute arrangement for tonight's fundraiser. You're to help him." Sophie blinked in surprise. "Me? Are you sure?" "Yes," Evelyn said, her tone clipped. "He specifically asked for you. Don't keep him waiting." Sophie quickly washed her hands and made her way to the study, her mind racing. Khaled had never involved her in anything beyond menial tasks. "Why now?" She knocked on the door and entered when he called out. Khaled was standing by the window, his phone pressed to his ear. He gestured for Sophie to wait, finishing his call with a curt, "I'll handle it." When he turned to face her, his expression was all business. "There's an issue with the seating arrangements for tonight's event," he said. "Harper usually manages these details, but she's been delayed. I need you to step in." Sophie hesitated. "I don't know the first thing about seating arrangements." "Good," Khaled said, already moving toward the desk. then you won't come in with preconceived notions. Sometimes fresh eyes are exactly what's needed. He handed her a list of names and a diagram of the event space. Sophie scanned the papers, her heart sinking as she saw the sheer number of high-profile attendees. Business executives, politicians, celebrities. The task felt impossibly daunting. "What happens if I mess this up?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You won't," Khalid said simply, his tone leaving no room for doubt. Sophie looked at him, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. "You have a lot of faith in someone with no experience." "I have faith in someone who's proven they can think on their feet," Khalid replied. "You've already done that more times than I expected." The unexpected compliment caught her off guard, but she didn't dwell on it. Instead, she focused on the task at hand, spreading the papers across the desk and diving into the work. Khalid stood nearby, offering occasional input, but largely leaving her to figure things out on her own. As the hours passed, Sophie found herself growing more confident. The patterns in the names and connections began to emerge, and she adjusted the seating chart with precision. Khalid occasionally glanced over her shoulder, his presence both intimidating and oddly reassuring. Finally, Sophie straightened, setting down the pen with a mix of relief and pride. "I think it's done." Khalid took the chart and studied it carefully. After a moment, he nodded. "Not bad," he said, his voice carrying a note of approval. "You've avoided several potential disasters." "High praise," Sophie said, her sarcasm slipping through before she could stop herself. Khalid's lips twitched in what might have been a smile. "Don't let it go to your head." As the evening approached, Sophie watched from the sidelines as Khalid effortlessly navigated the fundraiser, his charm and authority commanding the room. The seating arrangements she had worked so hard on seemed to function seamlessly, and for once, she felt a sense of accomplishment rather than simply relief. Later, as the guests began to depart, Khalid found her standing near the entrance. "You handled yourself well tonight," he said, his tone lighter than usual. "Thanks," Sophie replied, feeling an unexpected warmth at his words. "I guess fresh eyes aren't so bad after all." "Maybe not," Khalid admitted. "But don't expect me to make a habit of this." Sophie smirked. "Noted." As Khalid walked away to bid farewell to another guest, Sophie couldn't help but feel that the evening had marked a turning point. For the first time, she hadn't just been a bystander in Khalid's world. She'd been part of it. And though she still had no idea where their uneasy alliance would lead, she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to fade into the background again. The mansion felt unusually quiet the next morning. Sophie was in the library, dusting shelves and rearranging books, when Khalid's voice cut through the stillness. "Sophie, come with me." She turned to find him standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. There was a weight to his tone that made her set the book in her hand down without hesitation. "Is something wrong?" she asked as she followed him down the hall. "Not yet," Khalid replied cryptically, "but I need your input." They walked to his private study, a room Sophie rarely entered unless summoned. On the desk sat a stack of papers and an envelope, its edges worn as though it had been handled many times. Khalid gestured for her to sit, then slid the envelope toward her. "Read it," he said simply. Sophie hesitated, unsure if she should. "Are you sure? This seems personal." "It is," Khalid said, his gaze fixed on her. "But I trust you to give me an honest opinion." Taking a deep breath, Sophie opened the envelope and pulled out a letter. The handwriting was neat and deliberate, the words stark against the cream-colored paper. As she read, her pulse quickened. The letter was from someone named Amir, a name Sophie didn't recognize, but the tone of the letter suggested a deep familiarity with Khalid. It spoke of regret, missed opportunities, and a desire to reconnect. There were mentions of past partnerships and veiled references to a falling out that had clearly left scars on both sides. When she finished, Sophie looked up at Khalid. His expression remained carefully blank, but there was a tension in his posture that betrayed his emotions. "Who was Amir?" she asked cautiously. "A former partner," Khalid said, his voice clipped. "We built something together years ago, but it ended badly. He made choices I couldn't condone, and I walked away. Now, after all this time, he's reaching out." Sophie studied him for a moment. "Do you think he's genuine?" I don't know, Khalid admitted. That's the problem. He's asking for a meeting, but I can't tell if it's reconciliation he wants, or something else. Why show me this? Sophie asked, still trying to piece together his reasoning. Khalid leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. Because you have no stake in this. You're not part of my world. You can see things clearly without bias. Sophie considered his words, then looked down at the letter again. It sounds like he's trying to make amends, she said carefully, but it also feels calculated. Like he knows exactly what to say to get a response from you. Khalid's jaw tightened, and Sophie could see the conflict in his eyes. That's what I'm afraid of, he said. He was always good at manipulation, at finding weaknesses and exploiting them. Then why consider meeting him at all? Sophie asked. Because, Khalid said, his voice heavy. If there's even a chance he's sincere, I need to know. Some things can't stay unresolved forever. Sophie nodded, understanding more than she expected. She knew what it was like to carry the weight of unfinished business, to wonder if a fractured relationship could ever be repaired. But she also knew the risks of opening old wounds. If you go, she said, choosing her words carefully, go on your terms. Make it clear that you're not the same person he once knew. Khalid studied her for a long moment before nodding. You're right. As usual. The faint hint of a smile in his voice caught her off guard, but she didn't dwell on it. Instead, she stood, the tension in the room still thick, but somehow lighter than before. Good luck, she said, heading for the door. Sophie, Khalid called after her. She turned to find him watching her, his expression unreadable. Thank you, she nodded, unsure of what to say, and left the study. As she walked back to the library, Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that Khalid's decision to trust her with something so personal was a turning point. For all his walls and defenses, he was beginning to let her in. But with that trust came a new sense of responsibility, and Sophie wasn't sure she was ready for what it might mean. The black car idled in front of the mansion, its sleek lines gleaming under the mid-morning sun. Sophie stood near the entrance, watching as Khalid adjusted his cufflinks with the precision of someone preparing for battle. There was a tension in the air that felt almost tangible, and she couldn't shake the feeling that this meeting with Amir was going to change everything. You're sure you don't want anyone with you? Sophie asked, breaking the silence. Khalid glanced at her, his expression unreadable. If this is a trap, bringing someone along won't make a difference. And if it's not, I'd rather handle it alone. Sophie nodded, though her unease lingered. Just be careful. He smirked faintly. I always am. With that, he climbed into the car, and the driver pulled away, leaving Sophie standing on the steps. As the vehicle disappeared down the long driveway, she felt an inexplicable urge to follow. Instead, she turned back toward the mansion, her thoughts restless. Hours passed with agonizing slowness. Sophie busied herself with tasks around the house, but her mind kept drifting to Khalid. She replayed their conversations about Amir, wondering if there was more to the story than he had let on. She tried to reassure herself that Khalid was capable of handling whatever came his way, but the knot in her stomach refused to loosen. By early evening, the sound of the car returning jolted Sophie from her thoughts. She hurried to the front entrance, her heart racing. Khalid stepped out, his expression colder than she had ever seen. There was no visible sign of injury, but the tension in his posture was unmistakable. What happened? Sophie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Khalid didn't answer immediately. He walked past her and into the house, his steps deliberate and heavy. Sophie followed, keeping a cautious distance. When he finally spoke, his voice was sharp and clipped. He wants back in, Khalid said, dropping his coat onto a nearby chair. Claims he's changed, that he regrets everything. Do you believe him? Sophie asked. Khalid turned to face her, his eyes hard. I don't know. But he didn't come empty-handed. He pulled a folder from his briefcase and handed it to her. Sophie opened it, her breath catching as she skimmed the contents. It was a series of documents, contracts, bank statements, and emails, all tied to a series of deals Khalid had never mentioned before. The implications were staggering. What is this? Sophie asked, her voice trembling. Evidence, Khalid said. Of corruption. Deals Amir orchestrated without my knowledge years ago. Deals that could destroy everything if they were made public. Sophie's eyes widened. He's blackmailing you? Not outright, Khalid said, his tone bitter. He claims he brought this to me as a gesture of goodwill, a way to make amends. But it's a message, clear as day. He holds the cards now. Sophie felt a surge of anger on Khalid's behalf. What are you going to do? I haven't decided yet, Khalid admitted, running a hand through his hair. If I let him back into my business, I risk everything I've built. But if I shut him out, he could burn it all to the ground. Sophie hesitated, then stepped closer. You don't have to face this alone. Khalid's gaze softened, if only for a moment. I appreciate that, Sophie, but this is my mess to clean up. Maybe, Sophie said, her voice steady. But that doesn't mean you can't ask for help. Khalid studied her, his expression conflicted. Finally, he nodded, the smallest hint of vulnerability breaking through his hardened exterior. You're right. But for now, I need to think. Sophie didn't press further. She knew Khalid well enough to understand that he needed space to process. As he retreated to his study, she resolved to do what she could to support him, even if it meant working behind the scenes. As night fell over the mansion, Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that Amir's reappearance was just the beginning. The trust Khalid had shown her felt like both a gift and a burden, and she couldn't help but wonder if she was truly ready for what lay ahead. The next morning, Khalid emerged from his study, looking as though he hadn't slept. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, but his steps were purposeful, and there was a determination in his expression that Sophie hadn't seen before. We need to talk, he said, gesturing for her to follow him to the library. Sophie complied without question, her heart pounding in anticipation. She'd spent the night trying to piece together how she could help, but Khalid had been locked away, unreachable. Now, as she sat across from him in the quiet of the library, she felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. I've made my decision, Khalid began, his voice steady. Amir thinks he holds all the power because of the evidence he brought me. What he doesn't realize is that I've spent years preparing for this. Sophie frowned. What do you mean? Khalid leaned forward, his tone sharp and deliberate. I have my own documentation, proof of every legitimate deal I've made, and the steps I've taken to distance myself from Amir's actions. If he tries to use those documents against me, he'll implicate himself in the process. It's a risk he can't afford to take. Relief washed over Sophie, but it was tempered by the tension still etched across Khalid's face. So, you're not going to let him back in? No, Khalid said firmly. I'm done letting people like Amir dictate the terms of my life. I've spent too long cleaning up the messes others left behind. It's time I focus on what matters. Sophie hesitated, sensing there was more to his words. And what matters to you now? Khalid met her gaze, and for a moment, the stoic mask he wore so often seemed to crumble. I've realized something over the past few weeks, he said. All the wealth, power, and success in the world mean nothing if you have no one to share it with. Sophie's breath caught, but Khalid continued before she could respond. You've reminded me of that, Sophie. You came into my life when I wasn't looking for change, but you forced me to confront parts of myself I'd buried for years. And for that, I owe you more than I can ever repay. Sophie's cheeks flushed, but she refused to let herself be overwhelmed. You don't owe me anything, Khalid. You gave me a chance when no one else would. I just tried to make the most of it. Khalid smiled faintly, the tension in his posture easing. And you did. More than I expected. Before Sophie could reply, Khalid's phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at the screen and sighed. It's Amir. No doubt he's waiting for my answer. Are you ready to face him? Sophie asked. I am, Khalid said, his voice resolute. And I want you to be there. Me? Sophie's eyes widened. Why? Because you've earned my trust, Khalid said simply. And because I want him to see that I'm not the same person I was when he left. This time, I have someone in my corner. The sincerity in his words left Sophie momentarily speechless. Finally, she nodded. Okay, I'll be there. The meeting took place in a neutral location, a sleek, high-rise office with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city. Khalid entered first, his presence commanding as ever, with Sophie close behind. Amir was already seated at the table, his expression a mix of confidence and wariness. "You're late," Amir said, his voice laced with feigned irritation. Khalid ignored the comment and sat down, gesturing for Sophie to take the seat beside him. "Let's skip the pleasantries, Amir. You wanted a meeting. Here I am." Amir's gaze flicked to Sophie, his brow furrowing slightly. "And who's this?" "Someone I trust," Khalid replied, his tone firm. "Now, let's get to the point." The exchange that followed was tense, but Khalid remained unshakable. He presented his evidence with precision, dismantling Amir's leverage piece by piece. Sophie watched in awe as Khalid navigated the conversation with a calm authority that left Amir visibly unsettled. Finally, Amir leaned back in his chair, his smirk faltering. "You've changed, Khalid," he said, his tone almost admiring. "I underestimated you." "You always did," Khalid replied coldly. "And that's why this ends here. We're done." Amir stared at him for a long moment, then stood, his demeanor shifting to one of reluctant acceptance. "Fair enough. Good luck, Khalid. You'll need it." As Amir left the room, Khalid let out a slow breath. Sophie placed a hand on his arm, offering silent support. He turned to her, his expression softer than she'd ever seen. "Thank you," he said, "for everything." Sophie smiled. "I didn't do much. You were the one who stood up to him." "I couldn't have done it without you," Khalid said. "And I don't want to do any of this without you." Her heart skipped a beat, but before she could respond, Khalid continued, "I've spent too long chasing things that don't matter. It's time I start building something real. And if you're willing, I'd like you to be part of that." Sophie's smile widened, her chest filling with warmth. "I think I'd like that too." As they left the office together, the weight of the past began to lift. For the first time in years, both Khalid and Sophie felt a sense of hope, a belief that, despite everything they'd endured, the future held the promise of something better, something worth fighting for. This story reminds us that, no matter our age, we can always start over and find strength in the connections we create. What about you? Have you thought about the chapters you can still write in your own story?